thinking about what I was going to share with you guys this morning. At first I was going to talk about procrastination, but I said I'll do that another time. If nobody laughed, I was going to say Pastor Gary told me that. So, I don't have to pass that along. But no, I'm excited to share with you guys what's been on my heart and something that's been really impactful to me in my walk with Christ and trusting God in difficult times. So much easier to trust God and to cling to your faith in our times of comfort when everything is going well. But it's something very different to trust in God when things are falling apart. And so for me, one of the verses that's always been a favorite of mine and a favorite of me, Christ followers, is Jeremiah 29:11. For I know the plans I have for you, says the Lord, plans to prosper you, not to harm you, plans to give you a hope in the future. And I had a roommate in undergrad who would tease me that I would use this verse all the time, that I could use it in every sermon and paper. And really, for me, it's just been significant to see and understand and know that God has a purpose and plan, even when I can't see it, even when it's not evident to me, when things are out of control and falling apart. And so it's been a significant verse for me. But I recall a sermon that I was giving in undergrad, and in preparing for it, just really looking into the context in which it's written, because often when this verse is utilized, it's without reference to context whatsoever. You just hear this one verse and that's it, as if it was spoken in a vacuum. But for me, in plugging it into the context in which and to which it was written, really gave me a depth of understanding of what God was doing and saying to his people in this. And so I want to take a moment to plug that back into what was going on when Jeremiah wrote this, when God spoke this to his people, and what is going on in the lives of his people as they read this, as they're intended to. And it's easy to just read this and assume that, this is in a time of celebration, of victory, of comfort. But actually, this is part of a letter that God writes through Jeremiah to the people of God, sends through Baruch to the people of God living in exile in Babylon. And you might look and say, well, Babylon's not so bad, right? It's so much better than the previous exile in Egypt. They have a lot more freedoms. They're being treated a lot better. But you have to remember that they have been ripped from God's promised land, that they're forced to live under pagan rule, where idolatry is prevalent, where they're being tempted to syncretize, to mix Yahweh worship with idolatry, with pagan culture and theology. And for them, this is, God, where are you? Your people, who you gave this land to, you promised to our forefathers. You've allowed us to be ripped from it. Your promises are gone. Your faithfulness, where is it? Where are you? The gods of these foreign lands seem to have overtaken your people. It seems that you don't know or don't care or are unable to rescue your people. And so for the people of God, this is written to them in that anguish, in that brokenness, in that God-forsaken land, what it seems like and feels like to them. And so that for me gave an extra just depth to what God is saying to his people and how they're to interpret this in that time of their journey. Also, I want to spend some time this morning looking at James. It's towards the end of your New Testament and your Bibles. And before I get into some of the first chapter of James, I'll be looking at the same theme. I want to give some extra context here for the same purposes that I mentioned for Jeremiah. And that is, so James, brother of Jesus, brother of Jude, he is writing as a leader in the first century Christian church. He's writing to the Jews, the 12 tribes as dispersed, which gives the same pain that I just referenced with reference to Babylon. That he says in verse 1, this is written to the dispersed 12 tribes. That's not a proud fact, that we have been driven from the promised land and that we find ourselves in this pagan culture, pagan land, under pagan rule, amidst of idolatry, and their freedom to worship God is limited in how they do that. So So James starts off this letter reminding them of this. And so he's writing this letter to exhort them and encourage them amidst their difficulty, amidst their persecution from the outside, but also even from within, that they are persecuting each other. They're mistreating each other. They're dragging each other into court. So both internal and external struggles that they have. And James is writing to them to exhort them, to encourage them to live out a faithful life, to live out their faith in a consistent way, and to cling to that faith and who God is. So I want to look here in a couple verses in chapter 1, starting with verse 2. Consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance, and let endurance have its perfect result, so that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. So I'll stop there for a moment. So it's significant that it's not if you encounter various trials. It's when. It's the assumption, and he's already said that they're in the midst of this, but it's when you encounter these trials, you are to consider it a joy. And why are they to consider it a joy? Is it because he's calling them to be masochists who just enjoy persecution and eat difficulty for breakfast and disappointment for lunch? But no, that he's called them to consider it a joy because, and he uses this causal participle indicating the reason that you are to consider it a joy is because you know that the testing of your faith produces endurance, and the endurance allow it to have its perfect result so that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. The Greek word for perfect, teleos, actually comes from an older Greek word telos, which means end, result, goal. And so the idea, the Greek concept of perfect, of teleos, is that something has been brought to its intended goal, its intended purpose, its intended end, and therefore is perfect, lacking in nothing. So in this sense, that allow endurance to have its perfect result, that you have been brought to your intended end, your intended goal, and that is your maturity of faith, the perfection of your faith, lacking in nothing. So that God has the ability to move and work and speak and grow and mature your faith and you through these various testings that you go through, and it is for that reason that you are to consider it a joy. So, following in verse 5, but if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all generously and without reproach, and it will be given to him. So, if there's one of you who lacks wisdom, and the conditional sentence here in Greek indicates the belief of the speaker that if one of you lacks wisdom and one of you does, it assumes the truth, the validity of that. So this if-then conditional sentence, the way it's structured, we know that. So if one of you lacks wisdom and at least one of you does, he is to ask of God. Why ask of God? Why not read the Torah? Why not better observe the Sabbath? Why not do, ask your elders? Is it that there's no wisdom in these other things? No, he tells them to ask of God because God is the source. God is the source of wisdom. And what else does he tell us? Not only does God have the wisdom, he has the capability to provide that wisdom, but he's the kind of God who will, that he is the God who loves to give good gifts. And that it's not just that he has the ability to answer your prayers, to give wisdom to you, but he is the type of God who will give it, who loves to give good gifts to his children, who gives without reproach. Then in verse 13, so James is very interested here in the first chapter to focus in on, to cling to who God is, the character of God, what God is the source of. And that's significant in times of difficulty, that while our situations change, while our emotions, our perspective, our understanding changes, God remains the same God in all those scenarios. So if we can cling to the character of God, the person of God, who God is, that is a firm foundation for our faith, that no matter what else is transpiring in our lives, that God, we can cling to who he is. So James is very interested in this source. What God is the source of, what he is not the source of. He's the source of wisdom. He's the source of good things. He's not the source, as we see here in 13, of temptation. Let no one say when he is tempted, I'm being tempted by God. For God is without temptation, is how the Greek renders it. For he himself does not tempt anyone. God is not the source of temptation. He is the source of good things. Moving on, in 17, every good thing given and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shifting shadow. So God is without variation. He is not, while our situations change, his character does not. He remains the same God. And he is the God who not only has the ability, the power, the wisdom to provide and to answer, but he is the type of God who loves to give good gifts, who does give good gifts. So he has the ability and also the character that we can cling to. And so I wanted to share with you a little bit about our story. Even though a lot of you know bits and pieces, know of Ron and I's story, you haven't heard from me. And so I want to kind of give you a little bit of background here. And so Ron and I tried for a long time to start a family, and it was a challenging road. And in seeing that, everyone else seems to so easily have that. And God, why would you keep this from us? It's a good thing. It's a beautiful thing. Why would you? It's a good thing for us to aspire for. It's a good thing for us to desire, for us to want. Why is it that people who don't even desire it, they seem to have babies left and right? It's so unfair. God, why would you keep this from us? And struggling with this and trying different things over time, it became clear God was opening our hearts to the idea, the concept of adoption. And when I say our hearts, I mean my heart. And so we went to a few adoption meetings and just kind of learned and prayed over it. We're talking about it. And one day Ronna came home from work and said, one of my coworkers was telling me about the great need in the foster care system for foster parents. And I said, no way. That's for weird people, right? That's not for us. And of course, you're all saying, well, that qualifies you. What are you talking about? So I said, no, there's no way. So we're sitting in this foster care meeting. See what I did there? And God just broke our hearts for the need there, for these children that needed a loving home, to love them, to raise them, and to show Christ to them. And, I remember talking about it, and it seemed like signing up to become foster parents it's signing up to have your heart broken, to love without reciprocation, without any security that they will know of my love, that they will remember me or know who I am, that they'll know what I sacrificed for them. They may never know who Jesus is. We don't know how long they'll be with us. And signing up to have your heart ripped. And we said early on that they deserved to be loved enough to break our hearts if they have to leave. And so that's what we did. So we became licensed foster parents. And next slide. There we go. And here's Kinsley, actual size. And she changed our world forever. She was 5 weeks old when we got placed with Kinsley, and just fell in love with her right away. We actually took us 20 minutes to get her in the car seat. We were afraid that they were watching us through the windows at Child Protective Services. Like, they don't know what they're doing. We got to take her back. What's going on here? So definitely just a great moment for us, and God, you've provided what an amazing gift that you've given. So I had mentioned one of the concerns, one of the difficulties that we were well aware of what we were signing up for in that sense was that we could lose Kinsley at any time, and even though we loved her so much, that wasn't the greatest difficulty of foster parenting. Honestly, the hardest part of the journey was not just that we could lose one who we loved. It was that knowing that what we could lose her to, that I was powerless to protect her, to keep her safe, that if she were to be taken from us, knowing that she could not be in a safe environment, and I couldn't do anything about it. And she may not only not know who I am, but she may not know who Jesus is. That was the hardest part of the journey. That while initially we knew it was going to have difficulty, we hadn't fully appreciated that aspect of it. All right, moving on, Casey. So the journey was up and down, and a lot of highs and a lot of lows. And I appreciate all of your prayer and support as we were going through it. This picture just looks like a random picture here for us, carries a lot of emotions. This is all of Kinsley's things piled up by the door. After one of the court hearings, we were told that it wasn't a question of if, it was a question to whom she would go. And so we packed up all of her things, wrote her a goodbye note in her Bible. How do you write goodbye to a 7-month-old who you've loved from 5 weeks old? How do you put into words what she means to you? And you don't know if you'll see her again. I don't know if they'll even let her read it. That was the hardest letter I've had to write. So that evening, when the caseworker was scheduled to come to our home to get her, we thought she called us and told us that the magistrate had changed his mind and she was going to be with us for a while longer, still temporary. But we were so flooded with emotion. I've never cried and laughed so hard at the same time. And I just remember saying, "Isn't this the God that we serve?" So not long after that, little Ethan, 3.5 pound, 31 weeks, preemie, was born. And just amazing to see God's provision in his life to keep him safe. And as he's grown, you would never know now that he was so tiny. And he has kept us on our toes, changed everything, including color of my hair and my beard, as he points out often. So, praise God for Ethan in our lives. And next slide. And then finally, greatest Christmas present we've been given other than Christ. On December 23rd, 2015, God blessed us with adopting Kinsley and Ethan from foster care. And so it's amazing for us, the two little reminders every day of who God is, of his faithfulness and goodness, that for us, it was so difficult and at times to feel and see that, God, where are you? What are you doing? How can you allow this? How can you protect them? And our prayer was, God, go with them where we cannot. Keep your hand on them when we can't protect them. Would you? Would you raise them up to love you when we can't? And to see and recognize that God had a purpose and a plan. Plans to prosper, not to harm, to give a hope in the future. God had a purpose and a plan, even when it didn't look like or feel like that was the case. So what became evident to us was that in each one of these days, as well as representative also of many days in between, that while our circumstances were very, very different from one to the next, God remained the same. He remained trustworthy and faithful and good. That he remained the source of good things, that he was the God that we could cling to. And we see in the Old Testament that God constantly reminding his people, I am the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob who brought your ancestors out of Egypt. He's constantly reminding them of who he is, of what he's done. And so we can cling to who God is. That he's shown us his character and his faithfulness. So it is my exhortation this morning, my encouragement this morning is to cling to who God is and who he's shown himself to be, even when, and especially when you find yourself in a foreign land that looks so absent of God's presence. When it looks like, God, where are you? What are you doing? How could you possibly make good out of this? That God remains the same God and he deserves our praise the same day, the same way on both days. On our greatest of days and our most troubled of days. Would you pray with me this morning?